Hello, everyone. In previous videos, we covered some of the basics, right? I kind of introduced serverless, Matterless, why it exists, and so on. And then in the other video, I kind of covered the kind of foundational constructs that are there, the functions, jobs, events, and the data store API, and things like that. In this video, I kind of want to show you the Matterless's macro system, which kind of allows you to build another level of abstraction on top of those kind of core foundational things and make it much more easy to kind of like build Matterless applications. So let's dig into it. So what I kind of want to end up having, and it's not built into Matterless, is a type of like a simple cron type functionality. Kind of I want to trigger a function every second or every minute or something like this, right? This is not built into Matterless as it is, but I can add it. So how do we kind of approach that? So let's start by kind of using the tools we already know and build it that way, and then we figure out how to build the abstraction. So what I would want is to have a function that is like every second, like called every second, that I kind of want to be invoked, JavaScript every second. Handle, and it will just do a console log, right? Second passed. Okay, and let me just immediately run this. Run hello macro with watching. Again, like this doesn't do anything. We know about this, right? We can trigger it manually. It will print second passed. Cool. Then I kind of say, okay, well, I want to have this listen to an event that is going to trigger this, right? So not JavaScript, but YAML. And this is the every second event, and it should trigger the every second function. Again, this doesn't do anything, but now I can trigger the every second event, and that in turn will invoke the function, a second pass. Okay, so that's cool. Now the next step. So now we're going to create a job that basically will do this type of set interval type of functionality, right? Like that every second would trigger an event, which in turn will trigger the function. So let's add that. I'm going to add a job. Let's call it cronish or whatever. Again, I'm going to write this in JavaScript. And as you may remember, you have to not create a handle function, but a start function. And what this is going to do is basically, set interval, trigger, publish an event every second. So let's import the events API. Events from matterless.ts, and then here we're going to do event.publish every second. All right, save that, and boom, there you go. Every second, now we have this function up here being triggered because every second the job is publishing an event and the event is triggering the function and so on. So that's cool, but we don't want to write this code every time, and we kind of want to make it a little bit more configurable. So let's first take a first step in making it a little bit more like configurable and reusable. For this, I'm going to use some functionality, like features that I actually didn't cover in previous videos. Like you can have jobs and functions can have kind of initialization, kind of like configuration type blocks in addition to the code itself. So let's see what that looks like. The way it works is you basically can add an additional code block, fenced code block in YAML. And then there's an init argument, which you can pass arbitrary arguments, basically. It can, usually it's an object, but it could be an array or something like this. So what I want to kind of extract here is, first of all, the interval itself. I want to make this configurable. And the second one is the name of the event. So let's start with the interval. So let's make this 1 for 1 second, and then the event, I'm going to still call every second. And then the way you can get access to these initialization variables is through this init. We saw init, this is the cold start function. What you didn't know is that it actually is passed a kind of an initialization configuration object as an argument. And we can use this here. So let's create some global, let's keep this in a global variable. So we want to keep the interval, we want to keep the event name. and we're going to pull this from the configuration object. So interval equals configuration.interval, and event name is going to be configuration.event. This is interval because this is interval, this is event because this is event, right? And now over here, I'm going to replace that. So here now I'm going to pull this from event name. And here I'm going to do 1,000 times interval, because you have to specify it in seconds. All right, let's save this. And it immediately, it kicks in, right? So now if I turn this into 5 and I save this again, every 5 seconds, the function should be triggered. Let's see what happens. Yeah, now it's every 5 seconds, right? All right, cool. So that's step number 1. All right, this is useful. Like if I can, what I kind of want to have, so let me get to that. How would I like to be able to specify this type of thing? What would be more convenient for me? Well, actually, what I would really like is that I could do this. I would like to be able to do this, cron, my cron, and then in the YAML, because I like YAML, I want to use YAML for everything. What I want to specify is the interval. So 1, for instance, and I want to specify the function to be invoked every, in this case, second, every second. That would be nice, right? If I have this, so I don't have to write a job, I don't have to handle the event stuff. I kind of want to just have this happen. But I saved it and it says, hey, no such macro cron. All right, so this doesn't exist yet. So let's define it. How do we do that? Well, for this we use another definition type, which is called macro. The macro has to have a name, and we're going to call it cron, and a template. And the templates are defined in Go template syntax. There will be links to where that is later on. But basically, it kind of like allows you to inject certain arguments into this thing. So the arguments that I want to kind of inject are the interval, not the event. Honestly, I don't really care about the event name, but what I do want to kind of like replace is this, right? So how do we do this? Well, we kind of lift this whole piece of code, and go one level deeper. We indented one level, which makes it a code block. So usually I say like, hey, here's the template, just for documentation purposes. And now, basically, every time you use the cron macro, it will replace it with whatever is here, with some stuff replaced. So what do we want to replace? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, this event name, we want to make it configurable. And we want to kind of use the name of the cron that we're going to specify. And that's put in $name. And then I'm going to prefix that with event. So here I'm saying cron, my cron, $name will be kind of bound to $name. So we're kind of injecting that, replacing that in here. And then in here, what I want to put in there is the function, right? Like I say, hey, I want to have function. Cool. And for that, I can use arg.function. So the name of the kind of definition is put in $name, and all the arguments are in the YAML block are put in the $arg thing. And then I'm going to create a job cronish, which I'm going to replace also with something more specific to name. So the job is going to be called my cron, whatever. I don't really care about the names as long as it's kind of unique, right? And in here, I'm going to replace this one with arg interval, and the event with name event, because it has to be, this has to be the same as this, right? And honestly, that's it. And it immediately works. So that's cool, but that's not always the case. Let me change this to 2 now. Save it. So I kind of like knew what to do here, but it's kind of like tricky, right? Like what would actually happen if you write this code? And for that, we have a tool inside of Matterless called preprocessor, PP. And what you can do is kind of point it at a Matterless file. and run it. And now what it will do, it will create a hello macro.pp.md file. Collapse this. And what this will contain is basically the pre-processed Matterless definition after expanding, well, imports. I didn't talk about imports yet, but also the macros. So it kind of shows you this is the code that Matterless will now interpret after all the macros have been quote unquote expanded, right? So what is the code that's kind of internally being run? So first of all, there's this every second function, right? Which you kind of expect. Let me see if I can pull this to the right. This is what we wrote by hand over here. Where was it? Right, every second. So that's there. Second is like it created a job called cron. So that makes sense because that's what we told it to do, right? Job name cron. So it injected the name cron into there, and that turned into this job. And the job has an initialization block. It shows some other arguments that we didn't specify, but these are kind of default values internally. An init block with event cron event, and there's this interval value of 2, which it pulled from this argument, right? And then in the JavaScript code, honestly, it remains unchanged. And then in events, it injected the name of this event every second. So basically, cool. This worked exactly as I wanted. And there's still this macro cron definition because you can use this multiple times, right? So the macro is still defined. It's just no longer used in this this piece of code. So this is the most basic way of kind of creating macros. Now, what I can do is extract this into a gist or put it on GitHub or honestly put it on any URL I want. So I can pull this out, and you're not going to be able to see this because I'm going to do this in a different browser window. But what I'm now going to do is go to GitHub. I'm going to GitHub. Let me see if I can actually move this in frame a little bit. Yeah. So I'm just going to copy and paste this macro. I'm going to give it like a cron as a thing. I'm going to create a gist. I'm going to get access to this raw text, and I'm going to copy and paste this URL. All right, cool. Let's move back over here. Now, what I can do is I can say imports. So, sorry, header again. Imports. Boom. This is the URL that I got for my gist. And now when I save this, it's downloaded here somewhere. Yeah, here. Now fetching this URL, and it imported it. So now I've extracted my generic gist, my generic cron definition, moved it into a file. So this can be on GitHub, it can be a gist, it can be on S3, like whatever you want. It's just a URL. It will actually fetch the content of this URL and inject it into your application. And then you can use whatever is in there. So in this case, there's a cron macro there, which I can now use. So now my application basically went back to 19 lines of code. And it's just exactly what I want. It defines a cron, my cron, that runs every 2 seconds. Well, the function is still called every second, but whatever. And it works. We looked at, we used low-level foundational components. We turned it into a macro. We moved a macro into a library, which we can now use. And there's a bunch of libraries that you can build this way. And there's a couple I already built for you. There's a cron one, which actually looks a bit like this, but it uses the cron syntax. There's one for GitHub, so you can kind of poll GitHub for kind of events on repositories. There's a Mattermost client library built this way. And basically, all of them work the same way, right? There's a bunch of macros in them, so you can use higher level, definition types, and then import them. What I didn't cover here, but what's also possible, is to kind of define a schema for this format. I will maybe record a separate video on this topic, otherwise it's kind of documented, where you can kind of check that the arguments that are being passed here are, first of all, that they exist, that they have the proper format and type, because as you can kind of imagine, this whole macro expansion thing can go haywire very quickly. You can generate code that is hard to kind of understand, so it's good to have a little bit of help for the user of your macro to say, well, what are the arguments I can pass here? Because like otherwise it wouldn't be documented. What are the types? And kind of Matterless, if you define the schema for your macro, will check this for you. So it will, like all the macros that you'll find in the library right now have these schemas defined. So they will help you saying, well, you forgot to specify this argument. You forgot to specify this argument. This argument was supposed to be an object, but it actually is an array, this type of thing. Right? All right, that's a very quick introduction into the macro system of Matterless. I hope that was helpful. Thank you.